it seems to be now the season of punditry, the season of political expert opinion making about why that momentous moment happened in history. And we have the great debate ongoing, whether it was Gorbachev or Reagan, whether it was the Helsinki process or Havel, whether it was the Pope or the tens of thousands of people who took to the streets in those days. I think it's all the above, because history is often a mosaic of a number of pieces in combination. And also, I'd just like to suggest at the top of my remarks that when you think about those two probably most dramatic occasions in the fall of 1989, the fall of the wall and the Velvet Revolution here in Czechoslovakia, I guess it was called the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, there was a bit of serendipity and there was a bit of luck, and there were two remarkable journalistic errors at key moments at that time, and I'll tell you or remind you of them. One was in the Velvet Revolution, where three different news agencies erroneously reported the death of one student protester named Martin Schmidt. It was Reuters, it was Voice of America, and it was my organization, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that mistakenly reported at a key moment the death of this young gentleman that caused outrage and propelled even greater numbers of people to the streets. It was a mistake of history that had a positive effect. In the case of the Berlin Wall, it was equally remarkable. On November 9th, Monday, this coming Monday, there was a press conference in East Berlin, and the spokesman was a member of the East German Politburo, Günter Schabowski, who announced that there would be an end to travel restrictions for citizens of the German Democratic Republic. But it wasn't quite clear, and remember in those heady days it was very complicated and very stressful, and lots was happening. We have a minister here who probably, I guess, reads an immense amount, meets all day, and sleeps very little. Great stress. Schabowski announced the end of travel restrictions, and someone said, "Effective when?" And he fumbled through his papers and saw the words "ab sofort," effective immediately. He didn't see that in his papers there was a word written "embargoed until tomorrow." It was picked up promptly by ARD, West German television, which of course was watched in the East, and the announcer said, "This November 9th is a historic day. The gates of the Berlin Wall are open." And of course they weren't open. Not yet, and not at that time. But for the thousands of people in East Berlin who heard this, they reacted joyously. They poured into the streets. They surged toward the wall. And you know, as they say, the rest is history. These poor border guards simply became overwhelmed. By the way, that was ARD television in West Germany. ZDF, its competitor, its rival, said, without schadenfreude, I would say, it was one of the most beautiful mistakes in German history. Now, I said serendipity, and I said two journalistic mistakes, and I said luck. I've always been fond of the definition of luck, which is when preparedness meets opportunity. And of course, in this instance, it wasn't the journalistic mistakes that ended communism. It was the last two dramatic nails in the coffin, perhaps. But the preparedness was everything I mentioned before. It was Gorbachev, and it was the Pope, and it was Helsinki, and it was Ostpolitik, and it was Havel. But it was also very clear-minded, very steady, very serious, very shrewd Western policy of resolve. It was anchored in values. It had strategic objectives. It was self-confident, and it had resolve. Which brings us to today. Ratko, you've asked me, for my small part, to answer this question or say something about these common strategic objectives. And you said at the top, the subject of your conference today, and I think tomorrow morning, is about economy and defense. But you come from a group called European Values. We had a minister here who talked not only about values, but you, Mr. Minister, you, Stefan, said that values in the transatlantic relationship were never a functional matter. It was something deeper, something far more important, spiritual even. Well, all these things that are terribly important, like business, like economy, like competitiveness, like defense, it seems to me, have to be anchored constantly, have to be reaffirmed continually in a framework of common transatlantic values. Let me mention briefly 3 things that I have in mind on a practical basis. The first thing is simply, when pursuing all these things of commercial interest and defense and security objectives, that it is very important for us as a common transatlantic community to speak, as we say in American English, speak truth to power in authoritarian capitals. When I say that, and I'm someone who believes that human rights and democracy should always play an important role in our foreign policy, I'm certainly not oblivious to other very compelling interests. For example, oil. Or, for example, access to military bases. Or, for example, the need for cooperation to combat Islamic extremists. Or simply markets for our goods. I'm not oblivious to those. But it seems to me that history, and especially in this city, at this time, 20 years later, history reminds us that kowtowing to dictators, no matter the place or time, or no matter the other equities or interests, not only betrays our values, but it seldom works. Even when it yields, at times, short-term tactical gains, in the long run, it never pays, first. Second, what are our common strategic interests when it comes to values? Well, I think I'll propose something very simple, but I feel almost obligated as an American to propose it here in Prague, in the Czech Republic. And that is, as a common transatlantic community, that when we're looking outside globally, and to other countries outside of Europe and outside the United States, we always find ways to support dissidents who risk and sacrifice for freedom. Even in my own country, a short history relatively speaking, we would not have much accomplishment if it hadn't been for Patrick Henry during the independence days, or much later, nearly 200 years later, Martin Luther King, who was a dissident, who did heroic work in trying to correct one of our great birth defects, racism and segregation. And in this part of the world, without Sakharov, without Lech Walesa, without Václav Havel, it's hard to imagine where we'd be today to support dissidents. The third and final thing that I'll mention, and I feel obliged to here because of my current job and because of conviction, to support, to promote, to encourage free media and a free flow of information and ideas. It's an essential transatlantic value, but it's a universal value. That's not my opinion. If you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, drafted 60 years ago, and drafted, by the way, by a Canadian, by a Chinese, by a Lebanese, in that document, it asserts that all people, regardless of nationality or frontier, have a right to a free flow of information. I think that applies today to Central Asia, it applies to Iran, it applies to Russia. I think people tell us time and again that there's this universal demand for these things. Speaking truth to power in authoritarian capitals, no matter the other interests at stake, supporting dissidents, and providing, supporting, nurturing, encouraging this free flow of information. By the way, that's what Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty does today. I'm president of RFERL, and we would be out of business today, except business keeps coming to us. And today we broadcast in 20 countries and 28 languages, from Russia to the Middle East. Thankfully, not in Central Europe. Thankfully, not in the free Baltic countries. Finally, as a concluding word, when you propose these things at a conference like this, I'm not entirely naive, and I'm mindful that some people will go to a coffee break and say, good heavens, you know, what silly American idealism. Don't they understand how hard and complicated the world is? I'd only suggest to you in closing that when you look back to these kinds of issues and these kind of values and these kind of decisions during the Cold War, it looks kind of simple. And at the time, I don't think it was. And today, when we grapple with these problems, it always looks fiendishly difficult and complex. And I'd like to submit, probably not as difficult as some people may suggest. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.